everybody, and welcome to our week on the Atlantic Revolutions. The Atlantic Revolutions are a period of time in the late 18th and the early 19th century in which the power structure of European colonial systems is radically disrupted. Now, we must keep in mind that these revolutions don't just happen out of nowhere. They don't suddenly just pop up. They are the results of frustrations, angers, unredressed grievances that have existed for quite some time. Now, these are expressed in different ways in different locations. We're going to cover three of them. But while we do, I want you to keep in mind the quote from John F. Kennedy in 1962 that those who make peaceful revolution impossible will make violent revolution inevitable. He is absolutely correct. And although Kennedy gets a lot of things incorrect in some of his policy assessments, he is absolutely correct on this, historically speaking. Before we go too far, let's go ahead and recap some of the elements that play a part in our story so far. Now we did cover absolutism on the first week that we did our shift. We talked about absolutism rising in Europe as a necessity for the centralized governments in order for the king to have enough authority, and almost invariably it was a king. Occasionally it was an empress or a queen, but usually it is an absolute authority held by a man who has been born into his station. The reason for that is the sprawling size of their country and then later their colonial empire made it necessary to have some kind of central authority. But there's a slight hiccup to that, much like the line in the original Star Wars A New Hope. The tighter you squeeze your hand, the more it will slip through your fingers, much like sand, I guess. So the authority of these kings is tested by both issues abroad and issues at home. Everything is not rosy. One of the core problems is wealth inequality, rights inequality also. And to a degree, maybe a level of feeling disconnect from the home territory or the home country. Now, there is one slight exception to this absolutist rule, and that is England. England, although the authority is centralized in the home country, is more decentralized further out. When we get to, say, the 13 colonies, or if we get to the West Indies, they're very decentralized. Governors have a lot of power and a lot of authority, and that's just an expedience. Also, most of the time, the king or the queen does not exert as much direct authority as maybe the French did or the Spanish did, and instead it's filtered through Parliament. Now, that's not to say that Parliament can't have absolute authority. It's just a different type of authority. It's not true absolutism. Now, into this element of strong governance and centralized authority, or in the case of Parliament, this kind of insulated authority, we have the Enlightenment that arises, due in no small part to increased wealth in the European countries, increased access to technology. So, for instance, the printing press that creates the possibility of more books. More books makes it more likely that people will be able to read, learn how to read, perhaps think for themselves, absorb ideas that may have been foreign or unusual or interesting to them. It also allows for the proliferation of things like pamphlets, leaflets, broadsides, missives, newspapers, that sort of thing. So the easy replicability of news events, intellectual ideas, does lead to some serious questions, both in Europe and in the colonies, about the nature of governance, about the nature of human existence, whether it be economics or social interactions. Even the question of slavery begins to be questioned by some relatively radical groups fairly early on in the 17th century, and it begins to pick up steam by the 18th century and, of course, comes to a head by the 19th century. So we have the Enlightenment and absolutism kind of tangling in there. On top of that, we have some of the benefits of direct trade, both in Europe and in the colonies. And that's particularly important in two of our cases. That direct trade often is conducted by colonists to other ports. So they are able to make money directly without real interference or real oversight by their governments. They fly under the government flag. So, for instance, if you're the 13 colonies, you're flying under the British flag. If you're Haiti or Santo Domingue, you are flying under the French flag, and so on. There is a lot of direct trade that's involved with Asia, with India, Africa, even other parts of the colonies that exposes you to other people, other ideas, and helps spread not just money, not just goods, but also ideas, contacts. Mark Twain once wrote that that travel is the killer of ignorance. It's easy to think about people in another place because you've never met them. It's easy to demonize them and think them as aliens or not even human. But once you go there, it's really difficult to see them as anything other than human, to make those connections. And that's exactly what's happening with this direct trade. So many times the colonists become traders and they become the agents of moving a lot of these ideas around, whether wittingly or not. We're also going to talk a little bit about geography because there are four cases in your chapters that they talk about. We're only going to cover three of them, and that relatively briefly. It's up to you to read about the fourth case, so make sure that you understand the geography. We have this map here. Now, first off is Haiti. Haiti is the western part of an island called Santo Domingo. In fact, it now is known as the Dominican Republic and Haiti. Haiti is the western half of it. And it used to be a French colony. Santo Domingo, or the Dominican Republic, is actually a Spanish colony. So the Spanish and French basically split the island right down the middle. There's a very straight line separating the two countries. Of course, we have the 13 colonies. If you don't know where they are by now, well, now you do. We also will not well, we'll talk about France, but we will not touch upon Colombia. That's for your reading as well. So we've got France, Colombia, Haiti, and the 13 colonies. Now we've got some idea of the geography. And you can see why most of my dialogue so far has been talking about the colonies and the separation. But it's not just a distance separation. There's also a detachment from the ruling elite to the people who actually produce something, the people who actually make the economy, make the wealth happen. And there's increasing wealth disparity in the case of France, in the case of Haiti, in the case of Colombia, a little bit less so in the case of the colonies. That's more of kind of a special case. The burgeoning United States, or what would later become known as the United States, is in many ways a different case. 13 colonies are certainly not hurting in any way, and it's mostly an elite revolution. But it does borrow very heavily rhetorically from more populist, radicalist ideas from the Enlightenment, and in turn inspires far more radical revolutions in places like France and Haiti, and to a lesser degree Colombia. Well, we need to talk about a few very important people. I often think about the revolutions in terms of the people who had the most radical ideas that today we would find kind of common course. And we think about the way in which they conducted themselves and how very easily things could go awry. Now, in many ways, Tom Paine, Toussaint Louverture, and Maximilien de Robespierre are very familiar to us. All of them argued that it is the voice of the people that creates a government. And living in the 21st century in the United States, especially during an election year. We believe that. That is a narrative we like to tell ourselves, that we can express a change in government through our voice via the ballot box. And outside of the ballot box, that we can reach out to our representatives, that we can reach out to our senators, that we can reach out to our governors and say, this is wrong, this is what you should do, you should change your course. And we can expect to have some kind of dialogue with them. Well, before these revolutions, that is not a given in any way, shape, or form. It is not expected that the poor would be able to rise up and express their anger. That's a kind of chaos that is unthinkable. So first, let's talk about Tom Paine. Tom Paine was a very middlingly successful corset maker, which in the 18th century, that is a lucrative trade. Women bought corsets, period. Much like today, women might buy other types of underwear, whether it's bras or whatever. Um, he made it so he was making fairly good money, but he emigrated to the colonies because he felt like he could not find his fortune, could not find the footing that he needed. And in the colonies, he did, and he actually reinvented himself. He was an incredibly brilliant writer who was able to take these esoteric ideas of the Enlightenment, particularly of John Locke, that was based upon Aristotelian discussions and Platonic thought and Roman commentaries and harkens back to Latinesque roots and all these really kind of very nuanced ideas and distill them down so that people who don't have that elite level of education, that lifelong education at different universities learning Greek and Latin and the trivium of logic and rhetoric and grammar, he could break it down so that they understood and it resonated with them. He becomes an incredibly influential writer during the American Revolution and rallies otherwise placid or compliant populace towards the revolutionary banner. He becomes a very radical democratist. And what do we mean by that? Radical democratists believed that if you're going to give freedom to a certain group of people, let's say landed white elites in the United States, in the 13 colonies, you should then expand that rights to poorer white people, or to women, or to slaves, or to even Native Americans. Tom Paine wrote extensively during the Revolutionary War. He kind of submerged himself into this radicalist writing. And even by the end of the revolution, he saw the revolution as just the first of many revolutions. He argued for things like a universal basic income, because in order to be free, you have to be able to focus on your family. You have to be able to focus on keeping your standard of living, keeping yourself from starving. It's really hard to embrace radical ideas when you are basically living day to day, hoping that you can make ends meet, when you're worried about the looming specter of debt. He also argued for the abolition of religion, that religion was a way for which the powerful kept the less powerful or the ignorant or the oppressed quiescent, that kept them from being upset. He even travels to France during the French Revolution because he wanted to assist in some way, which almost winds up getting him into a very fatal situation. Now let's skip on over to Toussaint Louverture, somebody you probably have not heard very much of. He, in many ways, shares a lot of elements with Tom Paine and is kind of the bridge between Tom Paine and Maximilien Robespierre, although he becomes kind of, he lives after Robespierre is long dead. But Toussaint Louverture is this, again, a very radicalist democratist. He's a former slave who is well educated, who uses the rhetoric of the American Revolution, of the French Revolution, of uh, John Locke, of all the intellectuals to really rally a slave rebellion in Santo Domingue, what would later become known as Haiti. He becomes a kind of martyr to the revolution in a very roundabout way, and he's held up as kind of the George Washington of the poor, uh, oppressed slave class in the Caribbean and in West Indies. Maximilian Robespierre shows us how best intentions can eventually go awry and how power can corrupt. Maximilian Robespierre was a lawyer in France who really embraced the idea of championing the working class, what are known as the sans-culottes, the men without breeches, the people who wore just regular pants without an overbreech. Um, he embraced the working class and believed that the people should be the ultimate authority in France. However, once he became a very powerful figure within France, he instigated something called the Reign of Terror, where people were accused of betraying the revolution and were killed, publicly executed, or could be imprisoned for a very long time. He is the architect of that political crisis that really terrified European monarchies way more than the American Revolution did, and I would say on a comparative scale, far more than the later Haitian Revolution would. So he is an example of how that radicalist democracy can be corrupted into kind of absolutist authority or attempt at a kind of mercurial cult of personality authority that we should really keep in mind as things progress in our history course. So um, I want you to think about what circumstances are already present that are undermining royal power and authority in Europe. There are some elements already existing in Europe, not in the colonies. And I want you to think about those, and we may have mentioned one or maybe two already. And then on top of that, in order to understand why there was a challenge to these authorities, we have to think, where does imperial or maybe even just kingly authority come from? Where does that come from? According to an absolutist, where does it come from? And why does it come from that source? I mean, what is their rationale behind the source of that authority? And then, according to, say, a constitutional monarchy, where does that authority come from? And what set that in motion? And then I want you to think about now, what is the worth of a human being? What determines how valuable a human life is? And who says that? Who is telling you, or who is telling the average person in France or Germany or Italy or Spain or the Netherlands what value you have? Are you more valuable if you're rich, if you're powerful, if you're well born, if you hit the genetic lottery and are born into some kind of royal family? Are you somehow more valuable than maybe a child who was born to a destitute family or who becomes an orphan or somebody who works in a mine? So, who, though, is in control of the fate of all of these people, of humanity, for more or less of a general term? Who's in charge of what happens to people? And according to whom uh, is this reasoning drawn from? So who says that X is in charge of the fate of this nation? Well, there's a reckoning coming in the end of the 18th century. During the 18th century, we have the rise of these absolutist kings We have a rise in the standard of living. There's more wealth in the nations of Europe and in the colonies than ever before. There's more interconnected trade, the movement of people, of animals, of goods, of ideas than ever before. And then there's emerging questions, philosophical questions about the nature of humanity, about the nature of governance, the nature of the economy. We also have this rising middle class that really is chafing under the lack of political authority. If I have as much wealth and as much investment, maybe even more than a local lord, why does that local lord get to cling on to power even though he can barely afford candles or porridge in the morning, whereas I eat lavishly and I keep my house well lit and I have more servants than maybe he does? Why does that lord get to have authority over me? Shouldn't I have a say in the government, in the direction that the government should take? And then finally, governance. There's a governmental breakdown in every single situation. There's a disconnect between the needs of the people and the desires of those in power. And that drives revolution to actually happen. That's the breaking point. So let's look at North America, or at least the 13 colonies of Britain. So just to give you an overview, the 13 colonies had really been very lightly governed through most of its history. The monarchy and the parliament had very little authority that they exerted, partly due to the quirks of the way that that colonies were founded. They were founded often through charters. In some cases, some very wealthy individuals like William Penn owned outright chunks of land, and that was their property that people could live on. Luckily, William Penn was a Quaker, and he was kind of keen into expanding rights that would be carried forward by his son. So you have this very weird matrix of authority. You have companies that found Virginia and Massachusetts. You have political refugees and religious refugees that found colonies in New England. You have all these different matrices of authorities that create colonies, and so you have different experiences, and you have this decentralized authority in the colonies. So they are very, very lightly governed. A lot of the buck stops with the local governor. So the governor of Maryland has as much authority as the governor of Pennsylvania, and very rarely did they ever like talk to the King of England or to Parliament. And that was fine until we reach a very expensive and I would argue a early version of a world war known as the Seven Years' War. It's a war between France and England that spans across the globe. It even takes place in India and in the seas off of China and Japan. But for our cases, it really boils down to what the Americans refer to as the French and Indian War. It's more accurately the Seven Years' War. And it's where basically France loses the province of Quebec, what would later become part of Canada. And this was a very expensive war for both sides, for both England and France. So in order to kind of make up the difference of to try to consolidate the authority, to make up some money that had been lost, both the French and the English treasuries are mostly depleted. The British Parliament decides that they're going to impose a more regular assessment of tax. They're going to impose a little bit more direct control over the colonies. Towards that, there's a crackdown on smuggling, which we talked a little bit about trade a few weeks ago. Basically, trade was supposed to be authorized by Parliament. You had to have a permission to trade in order to engage in any kind of commerce across the ocean or even back and forth between colonies. Some Americans, some living in the colonies, did not like that, engaged in trade anyway. It was a kind of black market. even though they weren't doing anything nefarious. They were just trading, let's say, apples across state lines, across colony lines, as it were. Or maybe they were trading tobacco to a neighboring colony. That is taboo. That is breaking the law, and they're supposed to pay taxes. They're supposed to pay fees. They're supposed to pay money, and then there were certain uh, goods that they couldn't trade. For example, tea could not be traded. They could not go and acquire their own tea and sell it at home. So there's a crackdown on smuggling. There's an increase in the tax rate and the frequency in which taxes were collected. There's also a stronger British military presence where there had been a very light to almost non-existent military presence before. And of course, in as part of a settlement agreement with the native tribes in Canada and further west in the Ohio Valley and places like that, there was a restriction put on how far out colonists, European colonists, could settle. And this chafes at some of the Western settlers who were looking to acquire land of their own. Now, into this matrix of unmet needs and perhaps different desires between the colonies and the home state or the home country, we have the emergence of a young, well-educated, wealthy landowner, aristocratic intellectual, Thomas Jefferson. Although born in the colonies and not really an aristocrat, he moved in those circles. He had enough political connections, he had enough money, his family was very influential and well off, that he could receive some of the best education that money could buy. And he was deeply influenced by John Locke and other Enlightenment thinkers. And he began to believe, at least throughout his writings and in his early 20s and all the way up to the revolution, when the revolution actually happens, he's only 30 years old, 30, 32, somewhere around there, 30 or 32. So he's relatively young, very idealistic. He believed in the natural rights of man, that all men are created equal. He also believed in religious freedom and helped draft uh, text to that effect for Virginia, in which the Anglican Church should no longer have sole authority over Virginia, but you could have Baptists settle, you could have Jews settle, you could have Catholics settle. These kind of radical ideas, and at the heart of it, Thomas Jefferson was he would have not have considered himself a Christian so much as a deist. And what does a deist mean? Well, he believes that God doesn't interfere in his creation, that God created the universe and set into motion everything that's going to happen, and then he stands back and watches, kind of like a clockmaker kind of thing. So God doesn't play an active role. And Thomas Jefferson engages in a lot of these intellectualist pursuits where he tries to marry the philosophy of the Enlightenment to religious roots in many ways, but without adding those religious elements. He made this Bible, this so-called Jeffersonian Bible, where he takes passages out of the Bible that relate to Jesus's themes of humanism, of equality, of fairness, of morality, but he removes all the miracles, the magic and the nonsense he said detracts from it because people are expecting lightning bolts to come out of the blue, he once wrote. He also delved deeply into architecture, astronomy, mathematics. He was very, very high-minded, like a super, super educated professor. Absolutely disconnected. But he had these amazing ideas that he felt could fit perfectly for the 13 colonies. So I want you to consider the fact, however, that most colonists are not wealthy. Most of them are living day to day, eking out their lives. Many of them, if not most of them, are farmers in some way, shape, or form. They're not terribly well educated. The majority of their learning comes from hands-on tutorials, apprenticeships, that sort of thing. So would they understand things like Descartes' axiom that cogito ergo sum? Would they understand John Locke's underpinnings of his statement that all people are born of blank slate or tabula rasa? Would they have read Voltaire in the original French? Well, my instinct is, and the reality is, no. Most people, even today, who have access to the internet and can do translations, they probably never read Rene Descartes. Most people probably don't read Voltaire's Candide. They probably don't read John Locke's treatises on the natures and rights of man. They probably don't do that. They've got other concerns, right? So even in a high information period, like we are in the 21st century, people aren't reading that. So how can we expect people in the 18th century who don't have as much money, don't have as much leisure time, and don't have as much access to information, how can we expect them to have a familiarity with these concepts? These are very intellectual concepts. These are esoteric debates. So they wouldn't have known about Pliny the Elder, they wouldn't have known about Seneca, Plato, or Aristotle. They probably would not even care. They like, okay, is Aristotle going to help me bring in the harvest this year? Is Pliny the Elder going to assist me in defending my homestead? No, of course not. So they wouldn't really necessarily care. So how does the revolution come about? Well, some intellectuals are in favor of revolution, largely because of the increased amount of taxes they have to pay. To most working class and most poor, it just shifts the direction that the taxes have to go. And to be fair, a lot of times they didn't even have to pay taxes. They just had so few possessions it didn't really bother them where the taxes go. So mostly it's an upper middle class to elite concern that they're worried about taxes. Now they have to pay for the taxes on windows. They have to pay for taxes on paper or things like that. And then of course the crackdown on smuggling affects the wealthy far more than it does the unwealthy. Smuggling led to a very high price for tea, which was very profitable. And then when the East India Tea Company came in and lowered the price and made it illegal for anybody not stamped with a royal seal to trade in tea, that affected the livelihood of people like Paul Revere and John Hancock. So most colonists really lack the context for understanding high ideals, and this is largely the elite is getting kind of upset at these new taxes, and they argue for things like, representation in Parliament. They want to be able to send representatives to Parliament, just like people in England can send the different um, shires or the different areas in England can send in representatives. So how do we get the popular who are going to do the majority of fighting and dying for the revolution to see the revolution as necessary as the elite does, the people who are going to benefit the most from the revolution? Well, you either do one of two things. One, you engage in a long, painstaking, expensive project to educate everybody, and hopefully, eventually, sooner or later, they will be upset enough, just like you, and engage in these esoteric debates, just like you, or alternatively, you find somebody who can bridge the gap between the working class and the elite. And that's where my buddy Tom Paine comes in. Once John Adams had said, "Without the pen of Paine, the sword of Washington would have been raised in vain." Yes, they loved rhymes back then. They thought it was very witty to rhyme things, but let's let that slide. But he's right. John Adams is absolutely right. John Adams is a well-educated lawyer. He was fairly well off, not wealthy by any stretch at the beginning of the revolution, becomes more wealthy during and then after the revolution he becomes president. But he is absolutely right. Tom Paine is able to translate these really complex passages into something a little bit more distilled and a little bit more straightforward. He writes the Common Sense, which is a pamphlet, which is easily replicated. It is printed on printing presses throughout the colonies, and it's one of those consumable medias. If you lose a pamphlet, it's easy to get another one. So it's only a few pages long. It would be read in a tavern by somebody who could read. And so if you were a working class laborer, at the end of the day, you stop in for a pint at the tavern, some socialization, hanging out with your friends, maybe smoking a pipe, and then some guy is reading these very stirring passages by Tom Paine. And this maybe gets you upset at the monarchy. And this really kind of begins to open you up to the possibility of supporting a revolution. So once the revolution is underway, it's a lot harder than rhetorically the elites would have told you. Many times the conscription of, or the it was mostly a volunteer army at the very beginning. The time that you would spend in the military was supposed to be about 6 months. It was believed that the revolution would be relatively quick, or that there would be enough turnover, or people would maybe find the glory in battle and want to stand for their colonies, that they would re-up basically every 6 months. That wasn't happening, especially after loss after loss after loss at the hands of the British. When the revolution was at its lowest point was during the encampment at Valley Forge. It seemed as though the military was going to mutiny and just go home. They hadn't been paid. They hadn't been receiving adequate rations. They hadn't been receiving adequate support. The elite Continental Congress was busy bickering amongst each other about nonsense instead of getting down to the brass tacks of the actual running of the revolution. And there was not very much confidence in George Washington as a general in the Continental Congress. So there was a lot of political wrangling trying to get rid of him. And that's when Tom Paine comes to the rescue again, and he writes a pamphlet called American Crisis, which is a treatise that he writes about the separating those who truly believe from those who just fake believe, who just say the words but don't really mean it. And it's this really stirring, patriotic pamphlet that he writes. And George Washington reads it to his troops. He stands up and he puts glasses on and he makes this quip about how the war has taken everything from him, including his sight and his youth. And of course, it's a very humanizing moment. This very distant commander is talking to his officers and to the troops, and he reads American Crisis, and the potentially disastrous mutiny ends. It just peters out in the face of the words for Tom Paine. So Tom Paine plays an integral linchpin role in ensuring that the American Revolution happens and that it continues even in its darkest day. After Valley Forge, things begin to pick up. There begins to be some support from European powers against Britain. There's better training, more money. There are experts who are teaching the Americans to drill in European fighting conflicts, and so they begin to win some real battles, and it makes the revolution successful. So John Adams is absolutely correct. Now, after the war, there is very little need for a revolutionary voice, and especially because the elites have really acquired the kind of freedom that they hoped that they would get. They have this independence. They have a largely Anglo-centric governance. And so there's not really that much need for more radical revolution. Uh, J Thomas Jefferson gets into a little bit of hot water because he keeps writing even after the revolution about the need for the occasional revolution, like every 20 years the Constitution should be rewritten, that a little bit of rebellion now and then is a good thing, that the Tree of Liberty is watered with the blood of patriots, that sort of thing. So he occasionally talks about in very esoteric senses this idea of a continuing revolution. Well, Tom Paine picks up that ball and really runs with it. He writes a pamphlet called The Rights of Man, in which he talks about universal suffrage, about women being able to vote, about universal basic income, how in order to truly be free and not be beholden to some merchant master or maybe banker who owns your property, as a benefit of being an American citizen, part of the taxes that are collected, instead of going to the maintenance of a government, should be redistributed back out to the people so that they can at least raise their families in security. That you can't be educated, you can't be truly free unless you can determine your own path. And the only way to determine your own path is to have some kind of money. So that's a little startling, and that's a little like, oh, don't go that far. He goes a step even further, and he publishes this pamphlet called Age of Reason, in which he talks about how religion is being used in the colonies to really repress people, to make them quiescent, to make them passive, to really he really rails against this idea that the vicars are now, or the pastors or the preachers or the ministers now are like the people who didn't want revolution before the revolution. They're the ones who are like, oh, let's not go too far, that kind of thing. And for that, he was really kind of ostracized from American society, and he winds up going to France. Later on, when Tom Paine dies, his funeral is only attended by three people, none of whom were the founding fathers. Nobody showed up to his funeral, and in fact, now we don't even know where he's buried. There's some ideas as to where he's buried, but they don't know 100%. So that's how sad that is. The man who was, in my opinion, in the opinion of many historians, integral to the American Revolution is forgotten and just ignored. Now, part of the revolution, during the revolution, there were instances of civilian on civilian violence. There were instances of military on civilian violences on both sides, both the British and the Americans. For example, there was some revolutionary terror that was engaged in by patriots, loyalists who were beholden to the crown, or even people who were kind of on the fence, were often the targets of these loyalist revolutionaries. So to give you an idea of what kind of terror was visited upon these people, imagine you live in the middle of nowhere, then your nearest neighbor is several miles away. The only way you would be able to alert them of any problems would be to run there or ride a horse there in the middle of the night and hope to goodness you don't, break your neck falling off the horse or whatever. And suddenly you wake up as you hear voices outside your house, and there's people wearing masks who are carrying torches, and they're holding a midnight funeral for you. Your body in effigy lays in a coffin, and it's like a preview of what is going to happen to you if you don't change your ways. Tax collectors often were subjected to something called tar and feathering. I don't know if anybody's ever tarred like a roof or a driveway before, but tar has to be very hot in order to be liquid. And so this tar would be painted on somebody's body, and it would cause blisters and burnings, and it'd be exceedingly painful. And then worse, as it cools, it just keeps that heat in, making the pain that much worse. And then they would throw feathers on you and maybe toss you out of the town, or ride you out on a rail, which is they would tie you to like a long piece of wood and run you out of town, having to carry that big long piece of wood. That's what being run out on a rail means. Sometimes they'd be targets of arson. They would have businesses would be set on fire. If a newspaper wasn't sufficiently supportive of the revolution, they could find their printing press smashed to pieces, which is a very expensive bit of vandalism. And they would, of course, assassinate people. They would have lynch mobs. People would find people who weren't sufficiently supportive of the revolution and hang them without trial, without any ability to face your accuser. And this happened up and down the colonies, and it was largely patriots who were doing this, who are the revolutionaries who were doing this to the people who maybe were not supportive of the revolution. Eventually, however, the revolution is successful. Spoiler alert. The colonists convinced Spain and France and the Netherlands to assist in putting pressure, both military and financial, upon the British, and the British are unable to penetrate beyond the coasts. They hold the major cities like Philadelphia, New York, Charleston, Boston. They hold those cities for a while, but eventually they can't project deeper into the hinterland. That and the collapsing support within the colonies due to revolutionary terrorism essentially seals the fate of the British, and the expensive, costly, and embarrassing fight for the colonies is just, in the end, not worth it for the British. Now, to be fair, the British thought, okay, fine, we'll give them a taste of self-governing. They'll eventually fall to infighting. They'll fall to squabbling, and then we'll come back in because they're going to come. They're going to come crawling back to us. So to many in Britain, they felt like these revolutionaries, they don't understand what really goes into governing. So now what? Now that we have the revolution, now what happens? Well, there's a struggle in the 13 colonies between the rhetoric that kicks off the war and sustains the war about freedom, about equality, about rights, about representation. There's this rhetorical element that was useful during the war that becomes inconvenient after the war. So, for example, taxation. The whole idea, the whole motivating thing was that taxes are unfair, they're way too high, we should have representation. If we pay taxes in the colonies, shouldn't we be represented in the parliament? Well, after the war, after the Revolutionary War, most states drafted constitutions that had a property requirement. So you had to own X amount of property or X value worth of business in order to be able to vote. In other words, in order to be represented. But they didn't put a floor on who gets taxed. So everybody got taxed, but only some people got represented. So what does that mean for me? I'm being taxed without being represented. I can't have a vote in my government. Wait, this doesn't seem right. We're exchanging a British master for a local colonial, now American master, right? So what about the power of the government? Should there be a strong central government that has broad authorities, like an absolutist kind of quasi-monarchy? In fact, there was even the idea of making George Washington the king of America. Or should it be a decentralized government where local needs are met and we don't really have a central government? But if you don't have a central government, doesn't that make the country vulnerable to reinvasion by the British? Or if the French decide they're going to take, parts of the colonies back in reprisal for losing Canada? Or what about if Spain decides to invade from Florida? That sort of thing. Um, and you have this kind of tension between the rhetoric of the war and the reality of governance. And I think I have a couple of quotes here. Yes, I do. A little rebellion now and then is a good thing, says Thomas Jefferson. Not helpful if you're telling people to rebel against a newly formed government. And Thomas Paine even writes, "The world is my country, all mankind are my brethren, and to do good is my religion." He's talking about continuing the revolution. This is why he's writing these pamphlets. So you can see why there's maybe a desire to hush these voices up. A little more successful in Thomas Jefferson. They kind of co-opt him into the government. He's not terribly happy about that, but he really has a wake-up call when he finally becomes president, third president of the United States, and he changes his tune rather radically. Thomas Paine, as I mentioned before, he's ostracized, goes to France, gets himself in trouble, narrowly escapes the guillotine, comes back home and is forgotten and ignored. Let's shift gears and talk about Haiti. Haiti, the Haitian Revolution occurs after both the French Revolution and the and the American Revolution, but rhetorically, when we talk about radical ideas, you can see why maybe there might have been a need to put a lid on some of the radical ideas, but it can also act as a lesson of how history can inform revolutions. In other words, preventing them from going maybe too far and seeing that, yeah, we want this, but maybe not to that degree, kind of thing. So Santo Domingue is the island that I mentioned before, and it's divided between Spain and France. And in the western half, it is known as San Domingue. In the eastern half, it's known as Santo Domingo. So San Domingue, for our purposes, is the western half of the island. It's a very lucrative plantation for the French Empire, largely growing tobacco and sugar. It is an integral part of the French Empire. And after the French Revolution, when we have a nominally revolutionary government in the form of Napoleon Bonaparte in charge, who refers to himself as a son of the revolution, who's talking about changing the world, uh, a- out of that matrix comes Toussaint Louverture, who is a reasonably wealthy former slave. He had been a slave. He was able to be emancipated. He was able to buy his way to freedom. He became a landowner. He owned plantations and in many ways owned slaves himself. In many ways, he owned slaves himself, period. Uh, when, however, there were laws, the laws in France in the colonies were changed to make it harder for slaves to buy their freedom, to eventually get their freedom. He became increasingly radical. And in 1791, there was a slave rebellion that he felt drawn to. It had elements of the American Revolution and elements of the French Revolution, talking about the fraternity of the oppressed, of poor people, particularly of slaves who had been exploited for so many years. Many of these slaves had run away into the mountains of Central Domingue and had formed semi-allied, very amorphous rebel groups. He was drawn to the largest of those groups and very quickly rises in the ranks and becomes a kind of commander. He consolidates his power in this revolutionary group, absorbs smaller revolutionary groups, and as they become more successful, they draw more support from these other rebel groups. So he makes this kind of coalition of rebels. And a lot of the rhetoric that he uses to draw them in is drawn from the American Revolution and from the French Revolution. But he doesn't quite go as far as to say we need to destroy our oppressors. He wants to become a semi-autonomous province with equal rights to govern within the French Empire. So he doesn't want complete separation. He wants a radically democratic kind of French democracy in the lines that Napoleon established in conquered territories in places like Sicily and parts of Italy and Spain and that sort of thing. So he wants Haiti to be recognized as an important province within France. He also wants to end slavery, and in fact, he names himself governor for life. He ends slavery in 1793 with a stroke of a pen, frees all the slaves, that sort of thing. So um, very comfortable with his ideas so far, right? It's 21st century people. Of course, ending slavery seems like a no-brainer, right? Having equal rights seems like a no-brainer. Why can't we be part of the larger empire? And he's not being so radical as to say we want to completely split away. He says, in fact, he writes, I want liberty and equality to reign in Saint Domingue. I am working to make that happen. Unite yourselves to us, brothers, and fight with us for the same cause. He's talking to poor white people. He's talking to poor Germans and poor Poles who had come over to Saint Domingue trying to find their footing in a new world. Uh, so he's striking this very delicate balance between the rightful anger and rage of oppressed, abused slaves, former slaves, and Enlightenment ideals. So he's kind of a moderate approach. He wants to remain part of France, but he wants to be relatively autonomous. Yes, we are French. We will use the French army. We will, pay taxes to the French throne, whatever. But we're going to make our own policies, right? Um, he even at points, even though they fight against French soldiers, when there is a united threat, when the English, for example, or the Spanish try to invade Saint-Domingue, Toussaint Louverture very wisely, I would argue, maybe a little naively, allies with French commanders to drive out these foreign invaders. He doesn't want foreign people or foreign countries coming in and taking over and exchanging one master for another and having to fight endless wars, but it's also a way for him to prove his loyalty to France. Eventually, by about 1902, Louverture is betrayed. There's this very convoluted kind of Game of Thronesy plot to overthrow him, as his number two uh, is uh, is courted by the French commander. The French commander eventually convinces number two to kind of um, trick Toussaint Louverture. They capture Toussaint Louverture, and Toussaint is taken in chains back to France to face theoretical trial. He will never get there. And in a move that would probably elicit a lot of well does from 21st century readers. As soon as the French have Toussaint Louverture, they establish a very strong military presence and they reinstitute slavery in Santo Domingue. So barely a year after it had been ended. So why would a son of the revolution, a self-proclaimed son of the revolution, Napoleon Bonaparte, want to remove a fellow revolutionary named Louverture? And why would a radical slave, a former slave's commander, the man, sorry, Jean-Jacques Dessalines was the number two who betrayed Louverture. Why would the number two, who used to be a slave and was very radical, why would he ally with the French, who were very conservative, to undo the guy who's in the middle? Why would they do that? I mean, they pretty much achieved everything that they wanted to achieve. Why would he, then kind of, blow it all up? Well, Napoleon reinstituted slavery in Saint Domingue. Louverture dies in Paris in 1803. They transport him to Paris. He does not survive the winter. He's kept in the Bastille, and I don't know if you know anything about pre-20th century prisons, but they basically threw you in a stone cell with no fire, no heating, no blankets, nothing. So dying of exposure is not uncommon. If you don't want to take somebody to trial, you just keep them in prison until winter comes, and then just kind of happen to quote unquote forget to give him blankets, that sort of thing. Louverture dies in Paris, and this outrages this becomes a rhetorical outrage, a kind of point of martyrship for Jean-Jacques Dessalines. Um, on top of that, the former slave owners and even the poor whites, what is referred to as le Petit Blancs in Haiti, begin to take revenge against those slaves who had rebelled against them. And so there's kind of an internecine warfare that happens, kind of a civil war. And a rebel leader, Dessalines, leverages the death of Toussaint, kind of glossing over the fact that he played a very huge role in his arrest and capture, and promises to complete the revolution that Toussaint Louverture started. He goes further. He takes a step further, saying, "We don't want to be part of France. We want complete independence." So he's taking a page a little bit from the American Revolution, and the rebellion becomes a very racially based rebellion at this point. In fact, at one point, Jean-Jacques Dessalines promised that a white man's skin would be used for the parchment of the uh, of the Constitution of Haiti. So a white man's skin would be used for parchment, his skull for an inkwell, his blood for ink, and a bayonet for a pen. So it's not very moderate trying to find the middle ground between the two. The upshot is that the rebellion is successful, but the question is why would Napoleon undercut a moderate revolutionary, somebody who was addressing some, but not all, of the grievances of angry people, but also balancing it with real politics? Why would he even reinstitute slavery if he knew that that was the casus belli for this revolution? Why would Jean-Jacques Dessalines, whip up racial hatred? And why would he portray all whites as bad, all blacks as good, if blacks back during the pre-rebellion period could also own slaves? Well, 1804, Saint-Domingue eventually declares complete and total independence from France and renames itself Haiti, which is evocative of the name of the native tribe that used to live there. And right after the revolution, we see the violence that was present during the American Revolution and that would become prevalent in the French Revolution later after that, uh, becomes a reality in Haiti. The black revolutionaries target French whites, but they largely leave the Polish and German alone because they see the Polish and Germans as just as oppressed as the blacks were. Um, there's a kind of guardrails are attempted to put on this widespread slaughter, but it leads to a mass emigration from Haiti of people who either were of mixed race, so they're what we call Creole. They are part native, part French. Often were landholders and the affluent who flood cities like uh, New Orleans, Boston, uh, uh, Philadelphia, places like that. And in fact, this represents the first real refugee crisis for the new United States. Americans are very welcoming of these people. They see them as oppressed, as coming from an unstable country that they no longer felt safe in. There were charity drives to make sure that these new refugees had housing and that they were taken care of and welcomed into the community because the American people were really shocked at the lurid details that were coming out of Haiti. Some of which, of course, were exaggerated. Some of which were not, unfortunately. Sorry. So what happens now? Well, as I mentioned before, the refugees from Haiti fled into America. The United States, however, refuses to recognize the Haitian government. And that is an important question. The why. Okay. Well, we could easily say, well, it's the level of violence. That's an illegitimate government that wreaks havoc upon innocent or at least not powerful people in Haiti. That's absolutely a legitimate argument to make. But also, there's a racial element too. This is the first and only truly successful slave rebellion against a very powerful, overwhelming white government. And that has terrible implications for the United States, which still has slavery. Remember, I said that maybe some of that language about everybody needs to be free in the United States, maybe that needs to be tamped down a little bit. Maybe we need to keep that from being a reality. Um, so the idea of a successful slave rebellion that was able to unseat a very powerful French military, which was recognized at the time in 1804 as probably the most powerful military in the world at the time, that is worrisome because there are a lot of oppressed blacks who might hear news and might see the recognition of Haiti as a legitimate government as kind of tacit a tacit acceptance that blacks could self-govern. And if blacks could self-govern, why can't blacks be free? So it causes a lot of tension within the United States. Napoleon Bonaparte loses Haiti. Uh, that's the kind of doorway for the Louisiana Territory. So this informs his decision to maybe sell the Louisiana Territory to the United States at a very, very, very reasonable price. Because if you control Haiti, maybe you can keep the Louisiana Territory as a corridor for goods and grain and trade open. But if you don't control Haiti, or if it's in the hands of a hostile power, it's effectively useless to you. There's too many hostile powers. You don't have any safe ports. Time to dump this property before it becomes an albatross around your neck. Plus, seems like Napoleon was like, yeah, after I deal with the British, maybe I'll turn my eyes westward and reconquer these territories. So let's back up a little bit. Sandwiched between the American Revolution and the Haitian Revolution is the French Revolution, and this is where the violence really goes really off the rails and becomes a perhaps a lesson in the dehumanization that is natural when you have any kind of social conflict, and how it can really play out horribly if it's not kept in check, and if cooler heads don't prevail. So, as I mentioned before, the French treasury was depleted by the Seven Years' War. Unlike the British, which had a much more flexible economy, the French was a very much more static economy. It was a little bit less flexible, and so had to rely more heavily upon taxes and less upon tariffs. So taxes were increased, especially on the poor. This might have been okay if it weren't for the fact that there was also a famine happening. There were some crop failures that were happening in France as well. So this leads to civil unrest. Well, it also, in response to that civil unrest, rather than addressing the grievances of the poor people, maybe some tax relief, maybe tax the rich a little bit more than you tax the poor, but that flat tax was not sitting well with the poor who could barely afford to eat, many of whom starved or succumbed to disease because of poor nutrition. There was an increase in royal control. So there was a military presence would put down rebellions, because to rebel against the king is to rebel against God, essentially. Louis the 15th and then his successor Louis the 16th were forced, however, to implement a parliament, a kind of advisory body. It's an attempt to placate the more affluent, the people who did have at least some influence on the government. This was to quell the anger of the aristocracy, to kind of mollify the frustration of the middle class, but the people who were left out were the working class, the so-called sans-culottes. The sans-culottes means breeches. They're without breeches. They're people who just wear pants, like a savage. And though that voice was basically left out. So the middle class had a voice in the government, sort of. The aristocracy had a voice in the government, sort of. Uh, but the poor weren't, and the poor was the majority of France. The farmers, tradesmen, uh, artisans, itinerant merchants, you name it. These people, day laborers, whatever, they were the ones who were really left behind by this formation of parliament. The majority of French peasants were deeply impacted by the king's decisions. They bore the brunt of the military losses. So there was a lot of people who were killed in wars that seemed pointless in retrospect. They were bearing the burden of relatively higher taxes compared to the rich, the affluent. They could probably absorb even a 5% bump in their taxes, but for people who are barely living hand to mouth, a 5% bump in their taxes is a bit. That's quite a big jump. Um, They had less food because of the famine. They had more cases of people being imprisoned for being indebted. They had more cases of people being imprisoned for speaking out or speaking up against their supposed betters. And so they saw this as basically royal tyranny, that the king had lost all legitimacy. And so there was in July of 1789, there was a group of French peasants who stormed the fortified prison known as the Bastille, and released prisoners, political prisoners, criminals, you named it. They released everybody. And this was a way of the masses showing their power, that even though the king had most of the guns, even though the king had most of the power and most of the authority, just the masses themselves, just through sheer volume, could overtake even the most strongly held prisons and enact their will upon the aristocracy and the royal authority. This leads to a series of power struggles that leads to some chaotic policies. The revolution devolves into chaos. Eventually, it shows that the true authority of a king does not lie in some kind of divine commandment. It isn't derived from some kind of magical authority that they have, but really it's because of the consent of the people, because people decide that they're going to go along with the government. And this kind of revolutionary fervor leads to a radical restructuring of French society. Even things like the calendar. The calendar is restructured into what would be a much more logical calendar of 12 months of 30 days each, and then at the end of the year you have, I think it's like 4 or 5 days that you catch up. It's like a week, basically holiday at the end. But every month is 28 days or 30 days, something like that. It was just very, very rational, so that the first of the month always fell on a Monday. The end of the month always landed on a Sunday. So you knew, oh, it's the end of the month. When's the first of the month? Oh, it's Monday. That sort of thing. They restructured the names of the calendar, the names of the month, to get away from the classical references to, Julius and Augustus and, to September and October. So get rid of that Roman reference, and instead it became more about French society and more about France and more about the people and working and that sort of thing. So it was a kind of a proto-socialist experiment where people had equal rights. They referred to each other as citizens. In fact, the very slogan of the revolution very quickly became liberty, equality, and brotherhood, or liberté, égalité, fraternité. So, what's in a name? Now, during the revolution, there were a lot of broadsides that were printed for one side or against another. Broadsides are basically like the equivalent of a political pundit speaking to you through the television. This would just be printed instead. So it would talk about the sins of the opponent and glorify the greatness of the people who are loyal. So the best way to express that without teaching everybody French or going through a laborious translation and putting it in context is to give you an idea of the different pictures of how peasants were depicted both by the Republicans, the uh, people who wanted to institute a republic in France, the revolutionaries, and the royalists, those who wanted to keep the status quo. To the Republicans, the sans culottes, yes, wearing a battered hat, an old coat, and striped pants, absolutely. But otherwise, a relatively clean, hardworking, honest-looking individual who's holding a pike and a sword. So he's standing guard over the Republic, and he seems reasonable. Seems like an average person who is just doing their duty to support the land, to support the new Republic, to support his fellow human. Now compare that to the depiction of the Sans-Culier according to a royalist broadside. The Sans-Culier in this one is seen, well, pooping into the crown of the king and peeing on the mitre of the church, and so desecrating both, and literally running around without pants. In other words, running around in his underwear. So Sans-Culier could be considered without pants, but it really meant without breeches, without the fancy knee breeches that were in fashion at the time. You would have had a set of underpants that would have been tapered all the way down to the ankle, and then you put these breeches on. Shows that you have money because that's not practical. It's not practical to work in that, but it shows that you have affluence. So on the one hand, they're either guardians and clean shaven, honest, hardworking people, or they're the uncouth barbarians who poop and pee on things all over the place. So it just depends on how you're going to depict each other. It depends on which party you belong to, how you depict them. Now, into this fray, we have Maximilien Robespierre emerging. Before the revolution, he was a lawyer. He became a member of that kind of tacit parliament, and he argued in that parliament as a one of the few radical democratist voices for universal male suffrage. That even the poor, the sans-culottes, should be able to vote. Now, he was doing this largely to be a radical amongst a bunch of moderates, so he could accrue a lot of power to himself, and he did accrue a lot of attention. Um, and some would argue that he was an architect of the king's downfall, that he prodded the king a little too much with his radical opinions, well, like kind of needling him into making a mistake, into making mistake after mistake after mistake. Because you've got to imagine both these men, both Maximilien Robespierre and the king, have enormous egos. Maximilien Robespierre was very well educated. He came from a very well off family. He was one of the minor uh, aristocratic families who really chafed under the direct authority of the crown. So he had a bit of arrogance, and he knew exactly how to play Louis XVI to such a degree that Louis XVI made impulsive decision after impulsive decision after impulsive decision, which only made things worse. During the revolution, he becomes this very zealous advocate of republicanism. He appoints himself as one of three members of the Committee of Public Safety, the so-called triumvirate that would later become kind of a dictatorship. Uh, and he was often the one who accused his political rivals of being traitors to the revolution, and often wound up having them murdered by the state through execution at the guillotine. During the Reign of Terror between 1793 and 1794, there's this level of radical republicanism. There was a call to end Catholicism. There was going to be a renaming of the society and reshape it, even if by force. If you won't go along with it, we will murder you. Monsieur Guillotine was the force in which that change would be enacted. If you didn't go along with the crowd, if you didn't go along with the whims of the mob, as it were, you could find yourself excised from the society like a tumor. The Committee of Public Safety began to brand people as enemies of the people. Somewhere around 30,000 men and women die, including Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. So the execution of the old royalty, the very powerful aristocracy, they began to target the clergy as well. So this became kind of an orgy of murder, an orgy of revenge in many ways. And this absolutely terrorized the monarchies surrounding France, but also it afforded them an opportunity. France was so busy chewing itself up, obviously it wouldn't pay attention to external threats. And this is the one mistake that Europeans make. The moderates that surround the states, the provinces of France begin to start looking at this as more of an opportunity, maybe pay lip service to the revolution, but then reach out to powers like Prussia or England or to the German states or to Italy or even Spain and say, maybe if you came in and possibly put down this revolution, that would be a good thing. And so you have this series of wars that revolutionary France engages in, and the war allows for the rise of a young uh, uh, corporal in the artillery to rise up the ranks, a man named Napoleon Bonaparte. And in the midst of this reign of terror, during which Robespierre himself is accused as an enemy of the people, and evidence is compiled against him of his treachery, and he eventually is executed. In the middle of this reign of terror, there is a vacuum in power. And this allows for Napoleon Bonaparte to seize an opportunity in 1799 and create or recreate an imperial power structure. And he names himself emperor. Now, he does say that he is a child of the revolution, and I would argue he's absolutely correct because he doesn't come from a noble family, really. He was born in a small island off the coast of France that had been in possession of Italy for hundreds of years, had just barely been born a French citizen, so didn't really have a lot of standing in French aristocracy, worked his way up through the military. He cultivated an aura of authority, of command, and of a steady hand, that he would be a good steward for whatever entity he would find himself in, whether it was in the military or later on as Emperor of France. So, in the aftermath of this reign of terror, of this kind of heady moment of chaos, here comes this calming voice. And so Napoleon sees himself both as a product of the revolution, would have been impossible for him to become emperor without it, but at the same time, he sees himself as a necessary end to the revolution. So Napoleon does, however, end that republican infrastructure that was coming into place in France. And he does that for perhaps the most obvious of reasons. At this point, the Republican brand, for lack of a better term, has really been tarnished by the reign of terror, by the dictatorship of the triumvirate. And so it was time to return to a more traditional power structure. He does continue some of the wars and successfully prosecutes most of them, gobbling up territory after territory after territory, even defeating the vaunted Prussians. Prussian is part of what is now Germany, and they were renowned military powers. They were phenomenal military, but the French were able to defeat them because Bonaparte had learned some of the tricks that the Prussians would use and turned their strategies against them. He credited himself as the son of the revolution because, absolutely, totally right, that without the revolution he would not have ascended to power. But he was not keen to see his own power undone. Now, it's easy to paint him maybe as the calm statesman who needed to take control and that he was doing it in a very altruistic way. Some historians do portray him as that. But there's also an element of the hunger for power and of the tyrannical side that does emerge from Napoleon Bonaparte. A good example of that is the Haitian Revolution. A good example of that is the selling of the Louisiana Purchase or the Louisiana Territory to the United States with the idea that eventually he will come back and take it by force, perhaps even take the entire United States itself as well. So it wasn't that he was this paragon of virtue, this paragon of statesmanship. There was a level of ambition that he had and selfishness that he had. So he is a very complex individual, but he's an example of why these revolutions both happen and why sometimes they end. And maybe after seeing how the Haitian Revolution played out and how the French Revolution played out, we can give a little bit of credit to the founding fathers for maybe pumping the brakes on some of that revolutionary rhetoric, maybe slowing down some of this talk about radical democracy and freeing slaves and revolution every once and again. So in all the Atlantic revolutions, there seems to be an element of chaos and violence, whether it's the American Revolution, Haiti, or or France, or and you'll see that in Colombia when we talk about or when you read about that rather. So the questions I have as we draw to a close is, does revolution and mob violence go hand in hand? Are they inevitable? And if they are, then who is responsible for the violence? Is it the person saying the words that incites the violence, or is it the person who's actually doing the act and the person who said the words like, "Oh, this person's an enemy of the people," are they let off the hook? Is it ultimately the person who starts the rumor that so and so is a traitor, or is it the person who pulls the trigger, who murdered so and so? Would the act of violence, would it have happened without the words? Would it have been possible to perhaps prevented violence during these revolutions, especially citizen on citizen, non-combatant upon non-combatant violence? And then finally, if the United States is proud of its revolutionary heritage, what attitude does it take towards these other revolutions? And your book will look into that as well. Can we be proud of our revolutionary heritage and be okay with the level of violence that was used in our revolution and not be okay and not be proud of revolutions elsewhere? Where's the line? Where do we draw it? At what point do we say this and no further? So those are important questions for you to think as you finish up the chapter. Okay, and that is it for this week. I hope you have a great week. We'll see you again next week.